The station emerged from the darkness as though conjured by some grim sorcery. It was a gray silhouette in the moonlight, with walls that were more ruined than intact, and pillars whose carvings had been rubbed away by the relentless onslaught of time. No sign marked its name. No friendly lights glowed from within. It stood alone at the edge of a vast plain, and beyond its half-broken arches, the railroad tracks stretched into a void of blackness. A dry wind carried the scent of decay and dust, swirling in from who knew where. It was a place that existed at the threshold of night's deepest hour, a secret domain that seemed to stir to life only when all else was asleep. I first learned of the station from an old conductor who had retired decades ago. His eyes had a haunted cast when he spoke of it. He told me that trains no longer stopped there, at least not in any official capacity. "It's out of commission," he had said, "condemned, burned up in a fire before I was born. But sometimes, at midnight, you'll see it, and you'll hear it calling." His words at the time sounded like a myth or the ramblings of someone slipping into dementia, but there was no denying the way his expression darkened, as though he were remembering something he desperately tried to forget. Determined to dispel the curiosity that gnawed at me, I embarked on a journey. I was never the sort to leave a mystery alone, particularly one so eerie. My grandmother used to say that the dead can only harm the living if we stray too close to their resting places. But what if this station was a resting place of sorts? Complacent with my dusty camera, a flashlight, and a desire to see for myself what was rumor and what was real, I ventured out into the night. My journey took me along deserted back roads and through silent farming villages. Few people still lived in those parts, and even fewer showed any interest in conversation. An old woman scowled at me when I asked about the old station. "You'd best leave it alone," she whispered, shutting her door, in my face. Another man, stooped with age, simply crossed himself at the mention of it. But I was driving a road that had once been a thriving artery, and soon enough I found it a dirt path branching off from the main highway, leading to something that felt older, more primordial than mere farmland or countryside. The station's silhouette materialized out of a haze, a specter looming over a skeletal system of tracks that had rusted nearly to dust. Its clock tower was cracked and leaning at an angle, the face stuck eternally at 11:57. A faint greenish glow seemed to cling to the windows, though no lamps or electric lights were to be found. It was as if the moonlight concentrated on the shattered panes, giving them an otherworldly radiance. All around was silence, as though the world held its breath. I parked my car some distance away, drawn forward by a need to see more. Each step I took seemed to echo, as if the ground were hollow. The station door, what remained of it, hung off a rusted hinge. My flashlight beam poked into corners, revealing scattered debris, fragments of crumbling bricks, rotted wooden beams, and scraps of old papers. It was hard to imagine this place had once been busy with travelers. In the gloom, the destruction looked like the aftermath of a catastrophe. Spiderwebs coated everything in sticky, silken veils, and dust motes swirled with each movement, turning the air thick and claustrophobic. My plan was simple: explore the station, take photographs, then return home to prove it was nothing more than an abandoned structure. But the interior unsettled me at once. The wooden floor groaned in protest under my feet, and there was a faint hum in the stillness, almost like breathing, although far too deep and slow to be human. Hoping to dismiss it as the wind, I walked on. I found rooms that seemed to have once been offices or ticket counters. The shattered remains of a large glass clock stood in the corner of a main hall. Moonlight filtering through a hole in the ceiling bathed everything in a wavering pale glow. Across the main hall, I discovered a single operational corridor, the shadows elongated and trembling under my flashlight's uncertain beam. At the end of that corridor was a half-open door that led to a stairwell plunging beneath the station. Descending the narrow steps, I felt the temperature drop several degrees. My skin prickled, and I wrestled with the sensation that something was in the darkness with me, pressing close. The corridor below reeked of wet earth and stale air, as though no one had stepped foot there in years. My flashlight reflected off a sign on the wall that read, "Employees Only." The basement, if one could call it that, looked to have collapsed in on itself, yet there were passages that snaked into deeper recesses. Broken pipes jutted from the ceiling, leaking a black sludge. I tried stepping forward, but it felt as if the floor would give way. My courage, driven by curiosity, wavered. Finally, I retreated to the main level. There was something about that place, some intangible menace that forced its weight upon my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Returning to the station's platform, I checked the sky. Clouds moved across the moon, plunging the platform in and out of shifting darkness. The clock tower still read 11:57, yet my wristwatch indicated that midnight was only a minute away. My pulse thrummed with anticipation and dread. I remembered the old conductor's warning about the midnight hour. "You will hear it calling." A part of me expected to hear a distant whistle, but the hush was absolute. Then, just as my watch's second hand ticked over to midnight, there it was. It began as a distant rumble, like a train on tracks, a low thunder that swelled and vibrated through the walls. My heart hammered. No train should be running on rails that had long been torn apart by rust and neglect. Yet the sound drew closer. The station walls trembled, the rotted boards emitted a groan, and I could almost envision a locomotive materializing from the ether. A single note of a whistle sliced the silence, dissonant and forlorn, echoing across the empty plains. Then the voices started. At first they were faint, like echoes in a tunnel, short fragments of words that dissolved into sighs. "Help! Please, come back!" Each whisper reverberated through the station, like an unseen crowd drifting just out of sight. I froze, pressing my back against a pillar. Though my eyes told me there was no one there, my ears insisted an entire congregation surrounded me, calling out in twitching phantom dissonance. The trains of my childhood carried laughter, squealing children, and murmured conversations. But these voices were languid, as though coaxed from beyond a graveyard. They passed through the station, gained volume for a moment as though passing right in front of me, then faded away again. When the voices peaked, I could almost discern distinct individuals. A woman pleading in a foreign language, a man screaming, a child humming a lullaby. Then they would melt into a chorus that drifted beyond the edge of hearing. Terror rooted me in place. I became aware that I was the lone living soul in that domain of echoes. The voice of the woman seemed particularly close. It burrowed into my ears, quiet but urgent. "I can't leave. I can't leave," over and over, until it trailed off. I shut my eyes, resisting the urge to run blindly into the night. All the while, the station vibrated with that uncanny whistle and the wheels on track rumble. Daring to peek outside, I aimed my flashlight toward the rail lines. There lay the same rusted, broken tracks. Yet in the gloom, an impossible shape took form. A shadow of a train, tall and regal, with windows lit by some internal, pale glow. Its smokestack piped out swirling darkness instead of steam. I stared, disbelieving. The wheels were not connected to anything real, yet they rolled forward on rails that crumbled to flakes. It was like a film reel capturing a specter from decades gone by. Standing by one of the doors was a conductor, face hidden beneath the brim of a cap. His gloved hand beckoned in silent invitation. My heart hammered as I felt a flash of insane curiosity mixed with mortal fear. What if I stepped aboard? What would become of me? But I had learned enough to guess. I recalled the old story, "It allows only voices to return." The horror of that statement took on sudden clarity. If I boarded that train, I might be lost in the darkness forever, condemned to wander as one of those voice echoes haunting the station. Then, just as mysteriously as it had come, the train began to move on, gliding away into the night. The hopeless voices swelled in one last desperate lament, then faded into nothing but the whisper of wind. When it was gone, the station felt immeasurably still, as though emptier, having lost its momentary occupants. The remnants of adrenaline left my hands trembling. I needed to flee, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn away entirely. Some instinct told me I had to understand, or I'd never rest again. In the dark hours that followed, I sat on the crumbling platform, gripping the edge with white knuckles. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Impossibility crowded my thoughts. Well past midnight, the station returned to dead silence, but I sensed that it was only a matter of time before the next midnight train appeared. The coldness in the air intensified. I fumbled for my camera, flipped through the images, but found nothing. Every picture was black and distorted, as though the film had been exposed to scorching light or had simply refused to capture the presence of that spectral locomotive or its inhabitants. Morning arrived, revealing the station in a gentler, though no less disquieting, light. I considered leaving, driving away to safety and forgetting this nightmare. But if I left with only my second-hand story, who would believe me? Who would accept mere rumor and a failing memory? The logic seemed shaky, but in my exhausted state, I resolved to remain another night. Perhaps there was some phenomenon I could document in a way that wouldn't vanish from photographs. Perhaps I could capture sound recordings of those voices. With that in mind, determined and disturbed, I scoured the surrounding grounds for some clue to explain the station's curse. Behind the station, under a tangle of wild thorns, I uncovered a collapsed structure that might have been a storage shed. The roof was caved in, but in one corner I found a file cabinet, rusted shut. After a great deal of prying, I managed to wrench it open. Inside, most of the papers had been devoured by mold, but a few pages remained somewhat legible. They bore dates from the 1930s, passenger manifests, and cargo logs. One manifest caught my eye. It recorded a series of special services at midnight trains that arrived unscheduled, carrying no listed passenger name, only the numbers of seats filled. A single line in spidery handwriting read, "They boarded in darkness, they left in silence." That line repeated on multiple logs, as if the station officials recognized some pattern but said no more. The last dated entry mentioned an accident, a fire, the station partially destroyed, a missing group of individuals. No resolution, no closure, just an abrupt end. I spent the remainder of the day perched on the wasteland of a platform, mind churning. How had it started? A clandestine operation running midnight trains for those who wanted to disappear? Or was it something more sinister? Perhaps the station, even when it was operational, existed at a boundary between the living and the dead. As evening came, I prepared a small tape recorder, tested it twice to be sure it worked, then set it near the platform. I huddled nearby, cloak pulled tight against the chill, watchful as the hours dragged on. When midnight neared, the station's broken clock still read 11:57. My heart pounded once more in anticipation. Then, as though orchestrated by some cosmic conductor, the rumble started. That unholy whistle pierced the night, flooding me with dread. The station flickered like a wavering candle flame, and once again, I glimpsed the shape of that spectral train materializing out of gloom. This time, I clenched my fists and reminded myself I wanted to record it evidence, something tangible. The train seemed more vivid now. Its windows glowed an angry red. The wheels belched steam that drifted along the platform. A hiss accompanied the opening of the doors. Shadows stepped onto the platform, some shuffling, some gliding. Their voices swirled in the cold air. I pressed record on the tape deck, swallowing the tightness in my throat. These ghostly passengers wore tattered clothing from multiple eras, some from the 1930s, others from decades more recent. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions distant. One of them, a man with silver hair, drifted close to where I crouched. He opened his mouth, but no distinct words emerged, only a raspy whisper. I felt an overwhelming urge to answer him, to ask who he was. My voice froze in my throat. The presence of these lost souls was almost tangible, tinged with an ache for life that had long since slipped beyond reach. Their mouths moved as if reliving farewells or regrets. Then they drifted as a group into the station, wandering the corridors that had once bustled with living travelers. A sudden burst of static erupted from the tape recorder, and I stared at it in despair. The tiny device glowed, the indicator needle dancing erratically. It captured something, though I feared it would be distorted beyond comprehension. My attempts to photograph the scene yielded the same results as the previous night: darkness and flickers of red bursts. It was as though the station's midnight hauntings defied being pinned down by human instruments. A clang resounded, and I realized the train's doors were shutting. A wave of panic coursed through the shadowy passengers, their voices rising in a cacophony of sorrow. They rushed back toward the platform, but it was too late. A handful managed to slip aboard just before the final hiss. The rest turned, glancing about as though searching for a route of escape. And there he was, the conductor, standing on the steps of the carriage, face obscured, raising a gloved hand. He tapped his watch in a slow, deliberate motion, as though to remind the lost souls that the train stopped for no one. Suddenly, in a surge of inhuman speed, the conductor grabbed one of the wandering spirits, a young woman in a torn 1940s spiral dress, and pulled her onto the train. She let out a wail that tore through the night. Then the locomotive jerked into motion, sparks dancing from wheels that should not have been able to turn. The swirling forms on the platform cried out, their voices mixing with the whistle in a chaos of lament. The train pressed onward, vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind only the faint echoes of their desperate pleas. I realized, horrified, that some of them never made it back on. They now ambled aimlessly across the ruined station, bound to a prison of broken timbers and haunting memory. When the last echoes faded, I scrambled forward to retrieve the tape recorder. It was still running, but the battery was draining fast. My heart was pounding so hard that I feared it might burst from my chest. Even though I was surrounded by forlorn spirits, an uncontrollable sense of pity mingled with my terror. They were trapped in the limbo of that station, uncollected by the spectral train, left to wander without peace. As I retreated, a childlike figure approached. She wore a once wardrobe dress and had dark hollows where her eyes should have been. Her lips moved in slow motions as though trying to speak, but I heard nothing except a stirring of stale air. My throat constricted, and I stepped back. She vanished, merging with the shadows. By dawn, the lost spirits melted away into the corridors, as if the daylight banished them to the darker corners of the station. Exhaustion weighed on me, but I dared not sleep there among the ghosts. Instead, I recovered my recorder, leaving the station for a time. I retreated to my car, locked the doors, and allowed myself a few hours of restless slumber with the rising sun. When I woke, my arms were stiff and my neck ached from the awkward angle, yet my first thought was of the tape. Fumbling with the device, I pressed play. Static hissed. Then faint voices contorted into audible murmurs. My eyes widened as I made out a single phrase, repeated in anguished tones. No return, no return, no return. That was all. The rest dissolved into a jumbled screech. Yet it was enough to confirm that I hadn't dreamt the entire ordeal. Clutching the recorder, I glanced at the battered station in the distance. Tattered bits of fog crawled around the foundation, turning it into a silent, stoic sentinel. Could I leave these souls to their dismal fate? Did I even have the power to help? The story of that place was older than me, older than any living memory. Something malignant had sunk its claws into that station, ensuring no occupant who arrived at midnight could truly leave. Or, if they did leave, they returned only as voices on the wind. That evening, I ventured back inside with a newfound plan. Perhaps, if I could find the original source of the station's tormentsome artifact, or personal item belonging to the first departure, Maybe the hold would weaken. I rummaged through rooms, scouring every battered drawer, overturned shelf, and rubbish-strewn corner. The day's light waned, and cold shadows lengthened across the floor. At last, in the remains of an old office, I discovered an iron safe embedded in a back wall. It had rusted nearly shut, but after much effort the lock relented. Inside was a small logbook bound in peeling leather. The name on the cover, in gold letters, read Conductor's Record, 1897. My blood chilled. The logbook's entries detailed the station's earliest days. The initial caretaker, a man named Robert Eldridge, wrote of an unplanned train arriving one night filled with silent passengers. No record of them existed. He tried to speak with the conductor, a gentleman with a hollow look and a frozen clock for a watch. The more he pressed, the more the conductor smiled, an odd, empty grin. Eldridge chronicled the station's creeping changes thereafter. Nights haunted by screams, unearthly apparitions wandering the halls. The final pages were frantic scrawls about a sacrifice demanded by the midnight train, a price for each arrival. It wants bodies, Eldridge wrote in shaking pen. It wants living souls to feed its bleak passage. Voices are all that remain after. God forgive me. I closed the logbook, heart hammering. No wonder the station was cursed. Some cosmic deal had been struck, perhaps unwittingly, but a deal all the same. The train came for lives, and in return, it left only voices, phantoms bereft of flesh and peace. I wondered what disaster might befall if no travelers arrived. Would the station beckon the innocent from afar? Perhaps that explained why I had been lured here in the first place. Darkness fell. Another midnight approached. My greatest fear was that I had tempted fate too long. The station felt more sinister now, as if it recognized me. The rotting beams groaned, and the corridor seized with a pulsing life. My watch moved inexorably toward midnight. The old tower clock stayed perpetually at 11:57, an omen of what was soon to come. I clutched Eldridge's logbook, uncertain how it might help, only praying it was a talisman against the station's grip. Sure enough, the rumble came again. This time it thundered through the foundation, nearly knocking me off my feet. The train emerged, shimmering in pale gloom. Its windows flickered with strange light, and I could almost see skeletal shapes standing behind the glass. The whistle screamed, loud enough to make my ears ring. Doors slid open, and passengers poured out. Familiar voices echoed. Beyond them, the conductor stepped down, eyes hidden by shadow, his face just barely etched by the station's flickering lamps. He raised an arm, pointing directly at me. My heartbeat pounded in my skull. Some intangible force pushed me forward. It felt like gravity reversed, pulling me toward that train. I could sense the dreadful darkness inside its cars. I tried to resist, but the more I struggled, the stronger the pull became. My feet slid across the cracked floor, inching toward the platform's edge. Shadows converged, whispering in my ear, "Come, come." I remembered Eldridge's final entreaty. He had once stood in my place, writing by candlelight, believing he could break the cycle. Perhaps he had failed in the end, adding his voice to the station's echoing chorus. Yet if I was fated to vanish, I wanted to do so with some final act of defiance. Summoning my last reserve of will, I clutched the logbook and shouted, "I refuse you!" My voice cracked against the stone walls and disturbed the swirling spirits. For an instant, the conductor halted. My body shook as I pushed back from the edge. The momentum snapped. I stumbled onto my knees, breathing hard. The conductor's hand lowered, and his face contorted with a deep scowl. The train emitted a shriek so loud, I thought my skull would split. The dark swirling smoke from its stack rushed forth, enveloping the station. At that moment, every door, every window of the station slammed shut. The walls pulsed with malignant energy. The wailing spirits spun in a vortex around me, contorting in rage and despair. I closed my eyes, brandishing the logbook like a shield. Somewhere in that chaos rang the faint sound of a bell. A last warning, or a final knell. Then, as if a howling wind changed direction, the smoke was sucked back into the train. The conductor slapped the side of the carriage, a gesture of frustrated command. The lost passengers scrambled to reboard. One figure, the child in the white dress, lingered behind, her face turned toward me. For a moment, I saw not a hollow-eyed specter, but a little girl's solemn visage, tears gleaming in her eyes. A pang of sorrow clenched my chest. Then she flickered out of existence, reappearing on the train step. With a thunderous jolt, the locomotive started to depart. The engine's rumblings filled my head, and the station trembled in every beam. The ghosts who did not make it aboard were dragged into corners by intangible forces or dissolved directly into the rotted floor. The final high-pitched whistle cut through me, and the train vanished into the swirling black. Slowly, the station returned to its usual emptiness, the wind blowing once more through broken windows. A hush descended, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I stumbled outside in time to see the first faint streaks of dawn, soft and golden over the plains. The dryness in my throat felt like sandpaper. My hands shook. I clutched the logbook with white knuckles, uncertain how I had evaded the station's hungry midnight claim. The echoes were gone. The unearthly hush lingered, but no voices rose from the corridor. Alone, I realized I had done something that broke the established pattern, even if only temporarily. Whether I had fully lifted the curse or merely postponed its next harvest, I couldn't say. I never returned to that station after I drove away. Though nightmares plagued me, I never again heard that whistling call in my dreams. Eldridge logbook, though fragile and tattered, remains in my possession, a harrowing reminder. Sometimes I wonder if the midnight train comes for unsuspecting travelers elsewhere, slipping through some other location, repeating the ritual that bound it to claim flesh and return only voices. This world is rich in secrets we do not fully understand, and that lonely station might yet endure, waiting for midnight. And if it calls once more, I can only hope that the next passerby is wise enough to turn away, or strong enough to resist that final fatal invitation.